Hello everyone and warm welcome to this informational session focused on Bill S-211, Canada's new act on fighting against forced labor and child labor in supply chains. I'm Suveksha, a sustainability and a social impact practitioner, and I help businesses navigate their sustainability journey so that they can foster positive change and promote social responsibility. Today, I'm thrilled to shed some light on this significant piece of legislation. Our goal here is to unpack the key provisions of Bill S-211 and what businesses and institutions need to do so as to comply with this legislation, and what are the requirements in this act. But before we get into the specifics of the act itself, let's understand why there is a pressing need for legislation such as this. From a data-driven perspective, current estimates indicate that around 50 million individuals worldwide are trapped in modern slavery, with approximately 28 million enduring forced labor and about 17 million exploited just within the private sector. This alarming reality underscores the urgent global concerns regarding pervasive human rights violations and need for upholding corporations, businesses, institutions accountable for their unethical sourcing practices. And if you look at the due diligence legislation that has come into effect globally, we do see a shift from a voluntary to a mandatory landscape as well, with the voluntary business sustainability frameworks somehow failing to drive significant change. Policymakers have stepped up to make this shift from voluntary to mandatory regulations. For instance, California Transparency Act, which came into effect in 2015, the UK Modern Slavery Act that came into effect in 2015 as well. Similarly, the Modern Slavery Act in Australia that came into effect in 2018 all demonstrates this trend. All these due diligence legislations have three major aspects. The first, it requires companies to report. The second, it requires companies to undertake human rights due diligence, which you can see in the Duty of Vigilance Act in France and Dutch Labor Due Diligence Act. So essentially, it makes companies responsible for any adverse human rights impact caused by, contributed to, or directly linked to company operations or the operations of those with whom the company has a business relationship with. The third aspect these legislation have is import ban, as it's seen in the U.S. Customs, Border and Protection Regulation that came into effect in 2022. These act not only put a ban on the importation of goods manufactured or produced wholly or in part by forced labor, but also prohibits goods deemed to be made with forced labor, okay? So looking at all these legislation, we can clearly see that the Bill S-211 was not created in vacuum. Since Canada's many trading and investing partners had already taken steps to deal with these issues through mandatory legislation, so there was an additional pressure in the international space for Canada to demonstrate its commitment for human rights as well. So the discussion on the Bill S-211 began in 2018, culminating in its implementation in January 2024. This act, which is essentially a supply chain transparency act, aims at preventing and reducing risk of forced labor and child labor. The act mandates certain entities to thoroughly scrutinize their supply chains for any risk associated with child and forced labor. These entities must either confirm that they are not importing goods produced through child or forced labor. If such practices are found, they must also implement remedial measures. It urges entities to delve deeper into their supply chains to identify and address any instances of forced labor and child labor. So essentially, how does the Act define child labor and forced labor in this context? The Section 2 of the Act describes child labor as the services provided by those under the age of 18 under circumstances that are illegal in Canada, mentally, physically, socially, or morally dangerous for children, interfere with their schooling, or that constitutes the worst forms of child labor, as defined in the Article 3 of the 1999 Worst Forms of Child Labor Convention. As for forced labor, the Act interprets forced labor as services offered or provided by a person under unsafe circumstances, or that constitutes compulsory labor, as defined in Article 2 of the Forced Labor Convention 1930. So now we understand what the Act aims to do and how it defines child labor and forced labor, but whom does it apply to, as in whom does the Act apply to? Let's delve deeper into this. So the Act applies to Canadian federal government institutions, departments, crown corporations, subsidiaries, and private sector companies involved in producing, selling, or distributing goods. Section 2 of the Act defines entities as an organizations that are listed on a Canadian stock exchange, irrespective of where it is incorporated, okay? Has a connection to Canada, that is, has a place of business in Canada, does business in Canada, or has assets in Canada. And these defined entities have to meet at least 2 of these 3 conditions. And those conditions would be 1, the entity has at least $20 million in assets. 2, the entity has generated at least $40 million in revenue. And 3, the entity employs an average of at least 250 employees. So if you meet these thresholds, you will be considered as an entity for the purpose of this Act. Now you know what the thresholds are, and if you fall in this threshold, what do you have to do as an entity or an institution? How does the Act apply to you? So the Act essentially requires the qualifying entities or institutions to report on or before May 31st each year to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness the steps that the entities, or for that matter institutions, have taken during its previous financial year to prevent and reduce the risk of forced labor and child labor. It might be a single report for that entity, or it could be a joint report for the group of entities. So just to emphasize again, when you report for the previous financial year, okay? So it's retrospective in terms of reporting, like you do for your taxes. So there is no prohibition on adding future-oriented information though, but the requirement is essentially for what happened in the last financial year. So what do businesses or institutions have to report on? What is the requirement as per the Act? As per the Act, the report has to include a bunch of steps. The Section 6 of the Act requires the entities and institutions to report specifically on activities as seen on the list here. So one is each entity's structure, activities, and supply chain, so essentially the whole value chain. 2, policies and due diligence processes regarding forced labor and child labor. So any human rights policies, any forced labor or child labor policies that they have, and the procedures related to that. 3, parts of businesses and supply chains that carry risk, and the steps that have been taken to assess and manage that risk. So let's say any gap or risk assessments that the entities have taken of their operations or business as a whole. 4th, any remediation efforts that have been taken. So let's just say if the risk related to child labor or forced labor were identified, how does the entity remediate those risks or those issues? 5th, remediation efforts designed to offset the loss of income to the most vulnerable families. And 6th, any training provided to employees on forced and child labor. And lastly, or the 7th point would be how the entity determines its effectiveness in ensuring that forced and child labor are not used in producing or distributing the goods. Okay, so if you look at it, the list is quite comprehensive. Essentially, businesses are required to conduct risk assessment, implement robust policies and procedures, and develop training programs for employees on forced labor and child labor, or like human rights in general. So awareness, sensitization of employees, implement remediation measures for instances where forced labor or child labor are identified within the supply chains. So this may involve corrective actions, support for affected workers, and remedying any loss of income to vulnerable families impacted by these practices. So overall, you can say that this report will provide valuable insights into the structure, activities, and supply chain of businesses. So that it fosters transparency and accountability. Moving on to the implications, if you don't comply with this Act, what happens? So the Section 19 of the Act lists the penalties that are involved as a result of non-compliance to this Act. If any entity or institution fails to comply with the reporting requirement or knowingly makes or provides any false or misleading statement or information, such an act is punishable for a fine of up to $250,000 for the businesses and its directors and officers. So there is a management liability provision in this Act, and that would be probably of an interest for the board of directors or senior officers that are operating the business. So again, emphasizing there is management liability to this provision, okay, in this act. So in conclusion, the Act does represent, like enactment of this legislation does represent a significant step towards fostering ethical supply chain practices in Canada, ensuring accountability among Canadian entities. And we have seen as the regulatory landscapes continues to evolve, companies will have to prioritize supply chain due diligence and mitigate any risks related to forced labor and child labor. So today's session, I tried to sort of like give you a glimpse into the act itself, but then there is much more to uncover. In my upcoming videos, we'll be delving deeper into the legislation, examining its implications and practical implementation strategies from a granular perspective. So thank you so much for listening in today, and I can't wait to continue our exploration of this crucial topic in our future discussions. Thank you.